Today we'll be hearing from Piotr Naruchkowicz, Technical Manager for Greenhouse Gases, and Helge Hermansgaard, our BDM from DNV Maritime, and of course myself as your host. Before we get going, let's have a quick look at today's agenda. We'll be recapping the regulations as they are today. We'll have a look at some of the experiences gained from the EU ETS in its first year of being in operation. And then we'll look at some of the commercial aspects of the FuelEU Maritime regulation. Then we'll have our Q&A session. And along the way, we'll have a couple of polls to get your feedback on how you perceive the regulations or their impact in you already. So without any further delay, let's get on to our first presentation. Piotr, over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody. I'm happy to see so many of you joining us today. So my task for today is to give this session a bit of a regulatory and compliance twist. So let's kick it off with a regulatory recap. So to the very basics of FuelEU Maritime regulation that applies to ship above 5,000 gross tons, ships transporting cargo or passengers for commercial purposes in the EEA from 1st of January 2025. It does not apply to offshore ships unless these ships transport cargo or passengers for commercial purposes. And the very basics of the regulation is that vessels must meet annual well-to-wake GHG emissions intensity requirements calculated in well-to-wake perspective. The new features, something we have not seen before, are the flexibility mechanisms such as banking, borrowing, and pooling. So this would apply for ships which do not achieve the required GHG intensity, or the ships that perform beyond the required GHG intensity limit. So ships with negative compliance balance after application of the flexibility mechanisms will need to cover the penalty to stay compliant with the regulatory requirements. And the central point to all of this, so both for FuelEU Maritime and EU MRV and ETS reporting, is the operational vessel data. So the voyage data and port stay data, which is being used to calculate the EU MRV metrics from 2018. Among them are tank-to-wake emissions, now covering the 3 greenhouse gases, distance traveled and transport work, of course related to actual cargo carried on board. And based on EU MRV metrics and the numbers, the EU ETS relevant data is determined, of course considering the scope of greenhouse gases for a given year, the zero rating of certain fuels, geographical scope of a voyage with 50% reduction for voyages going into and out of the EU, carbon capture and storage, the so-called OMR voyages, voyages to outermost regions, to low populated islands, or voyages in scope of public service contract or public service obligation, reduction related to ice class A, and the phase-in percentage. But FuelEU Maritime uses the same data, putting on top the energy consumption from other energy sources, and this includes energy from received through shore power or other zero emission technologies. And based on the same voyage data and port state data, different metrics are calculated. So under FuelEU Maritime, we are looking at well-to-wake emissions, the total energy consumption including electricity, and the average GHG intensity of energy used in well-to-wake perspective. And from these metrics, one can calculate the FuelEU compliance balance, considering also some of the reductions so similar to EU ETS, but with some slight differences. And these deductions are related to sailing in ice or the fact of assignment of an ice class. Also, a deduction is granted for voyages going into outermost regions, low populated islands, and in scope of public service contract or public service obligation. And this is notified individually by member states to European Commission. There's also a reduction of energy in scope for voyages going into and out of EU. And as I said, this may sound similar to EU ETS derogations, but there are slight differences, and all of them are described in the relevant articles of FuelEU Maritime. Some practical recommendation related to data which needs to be collected under FuelEU Maritime, and this is related to electricity received from shore. So this is made part of the FuelEU Maritime reporting applying from 1st of January 25, and it is mandatory to report any kind of electricity used on board ships in scope of FuelEU Maritime. And plus it is of course beneficial for the FuelEU Maritime GHG compliance, because well-to-tank emission factor for electricity, at least in the first revision of the FuelEU regulation, is assumed as 0. And this requirement is not in any way related to the zero emission requirement applicable to passenger ships and container ships from 2030. It is simply a requirement that ships which have used electricity, have received electricity from shore power, they need to report consumption of that energy. And it is also a reminder that the electricity supplier in a given port should provide the shipping company with electricity delivery node, and the scope of information is outlined in FuelEU Regulation Annex 1. Continuing on additional data to be collected, FuelEU Maritime Regulation Article 10 sets out requirements for alternative fuels and the recognition under FuelEU Maritime. And here the evidence is also required under EU ETS for 0 rating. But in FuelEU Maritime calculations, we actually use the GHG intensity as stated in the proof of sustainability for the average GHG intensity calculation of energy used on board. And fuels not complying with requirements of the FuelEU Regulation Article 10 are not considered eligible and are considered as the least favorable fossil fuel. So with that in mind, companies must ensure that a document is made available from the fuel supplier stating the so-called E-value, which is established in accordance with EU RED directive. And for fuels other than fossil fuels and biofuels, the well-to-tank GHG emission factor. Now to briefly look at the timeline of FuelEU Maritime requirements. The FuelEU Monitoring Plan assessment is ongoing as we speak in preparation for the first year of reporting starting 1st of January 25. And throughout 25, the obligation to submit a partial emission report applies, and the partial emission report, it must be verified within 1 month after the company change. So it's actually quite a narrow timeline. After each year end, so for the first time in 26, the FuelEU annual report submission must happen by end of January, the submission to verifier. And having received the report, FuelEU verifier will perform verification, and this must be completed until end of March. And then following verification of the FuelEU report, so verification of related data, shipping company may apply flexibility mechanisms, which I will mention later. And related to the application of these mechanisms are additional verification activities carried out by verifier. All of this needs to be completed by end of April. And then in case of a compliance deficit, the FuelEU penalty must be settled with the competent authority. And once this is done, in case there was a penalty, the competent authority issues the DOC. In case there wasn't any penalty, then the FuelEU verifier must issue the document of compliance, FuelEU document of compliance, by end of June. And to the flexibility mechanism which I mentioned, among them we have compliance pooling with other ships. We have the option to borrow compliance from next year with an interest rate, and we also have the option to bank compliance to the next years, meaning that basically ships below the required GHG intensity can pool with ships which are above the required GHG intensity, with of course some limitations which we've covered in our previous webinars, so that the total compliance balance of the pool must be positive. Ships going into the pool with compliance surplus cannot end up with a deficit, and ships entering the pool with a deficit cannot end up with a deficit which is higher than it was before. A couple of words about the FuelEU, the so-called FuelEU allocation of fuels. So the calculation towards the GHG intensity, the average GHG intensity of energy used on board, is not performed simply by taking 50% or 100% of fuel mass used on a specific voyage, depending on geographical scope. And what we know so far is that fuels of low GHG intensity are prioritized towards FuelEU maritime scope, as I tried to present in this slide, having a fuel mix of biodiesel and some fossil fuels. Fuels used outside of FuelEU scope, so between two non-EEA ports, cannot be considered in that fuel mix. And now we expect clarification around that topic in the coming days, related to whether the allocation principles can also be applied to fossil fuels. So meaning in a case where we would not have biodiesel in the fuel mix, only MDO, LFO, and HFO. And then a bit of a status of FuelEU implementation on our side. We've seen that more than 80% of vessels subscribing to our service and potentially in scope of the regulation have submitted their FuelEU Maritime plan to DNV within the end of August deadline, and therefore fulfilling the regulatory requirement covering the plan submission. And I'm happy to announce that DNV has now been accredited under the FuelEU Maritime and can officially complete assessment of FuelEU Monitoring Plan in TETIS portal. And we will have separate communication reaching out to our customers very soon. And then lastly, a bit of a status on the IMO regulatory development related to GHG emissions. So IMO is implementing the 2023 GHG strategy and is working on the midterm measures to ensure that 2050 goals are met. And the basket of measures are expected to be adopted in 25 with entry into force in 27. And now this can be split into two parts, one being a technical element which mandates the use of lower GHG intensity marine fuels, and then an economic element related to pricing of GHG emissions. And within that basket, we also have the review of the recognition of onboard capture, carbon capture systems, and review of the CII reporting system and EEXI by end of 25. So that is my regulatory recap, and I will be handing over to Helga.
Thank you, Piotr. Then we are spending a little bit time on some lesson learned from the first year of the EU ETS, what we see and what we have heard. One of the key things that were a little bit of challenge early in the year was, of course, that the roles, the responsibility for ETS and MRV was with the owner. And there were a lot of discussion between owners and DOC and ISM companies who should actually have this responsibility. And what we have seen is that not too many ISM companies are eager to accept the mandate. That doesn't mean that they are not performing services on the owner's behalf, but the main responsibility in the interface to the authorities still remains with the owner of the vessel. We have seen little noise on the settlement between the different parties. I've seen some, of course, but relatively smooth sailing, I would say. I think we also face that there have been some struggles in the communication and with the different administering authorities, clarifying who should be your administering authority, getting registered MOHI accounts, etc., and a little bit time-consuming process there. But it's shaping up. Still a way to go, but there will be some exciting months ahead of us. We have seen that the contractual terms are key. BIMCO had their term published prior to the entry, but we see many versions of how ETS is managed between owners and charterers. There are different models, there are different frequency of settlements, but contractual terms are key. And I have had several calls last year where they say, well, I'm not getting my coverage, but that's also because the terms were not necessarily updated. We have experienced that companies realize that data quality is not that easy. And they had to invest a little bit time and effort in managing data quality and improving it, and taking away some of the root causes of these errors. And that might be some tuning of the performance data system, it might be some training. But when that is done in a proper way, it has been manageable. I would also say that we have seen an increased focus on verified data. When we started the year, there was not the biggest focus, but as charters have gained more and more experience and investigating data, the tendency, at least what I see, is that there's more focus on having verified data for agreeing how to handle the transaction between the owner and the charterer. A good thing, an interesting experience in the later months is that the companies who have good data quality and good tools are better prepared for managing and preparing for the FuelEU, and we are coming back to that a little bit later. If we go to the FuelEU Maritime and the commercial aspects, and I just name the number 19, and we have a picture of the vessel here. And 19 is, of course, the days before FuelEU Maritime enters into force. So we don't have too much time on this topic before it's highly relevant. And I would actually say that it's already relevant because we have signed commercial contracts that covers seaborne transport far into 2025 and beyond. Just to illustrate, and I'm not going into the details on the numbers here, but we have published now a white paper on the FuelEU Maritime, and sources listed at the bottom here, so you can click on that one if you want to get into the details. But we have tried to illustrate how two different scenarios. And on the left-hand side, you have a scenario where there is a vessel running on the fossil MGO for the lifetime, and say they will pay the penalty over the years. And this illustrates the increase in the annual expenses year by year. And of course, also with the additional penalty, if you have consecutive years of penalty, this is a quite tremendous jump going forward. It's not biting that much the first 5 years, but it starts aching properly in the next 5-year cycle, and really hurting thereafter. If in a way jump over to the right-hand side, where there is a strategy of using a bio blend with MGO, there are a significant different cost development. Of course, the fuel is slightly more expensive, but you also get the kind of reduction on the ETS bill. But if you compare the two scenarios, and here are of course different assumption, same and fixed assumption for the cost of the different fuels, we see a difference on the NPV in almost in the range of $100 million. And this is really what is the reason why most companies I'm meeting now is out in the market trying to find sources for greener fuel, so they can avoid paying the penalty. I would say penalty is the last resort in a way. If we look at roles and responsibilities, and this is, I think it's a little bit interesting because ISM company have the DCS and the FuelEU Maritime responsibility owners, the MRV and ETS responsibility, a commercial operator and a pool. They have no official role towards the authority, but they are securing coverage for these additional costs in their charter contract, and the charterer pays have to do a compensation. A polluter pay principle is referred to in many cases, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a separate settlement. One of the key things we have seen over the last year is that we have different data sources within the different roles. So a charterer might have their data set, the operator might have their data set, the ISM company might have a separate data set, and these data sets are not consistent. Consistency in data is going to be key in order to have smooth collaboration in the maritime value chains. And I'm coming back to that a little bit later. But let's look in the relationship between the ISM company and the owner. And what we see here is that the technical manager has basically little or no impact on the exposure here, because that's driven by the sailing pattern and the fuel used. They will not accept to carry this cost implication themselves. They will transfer this cost back to the owners, and they don't want to have a financial risk within this area as well. So they are aiming to reduce and minimize this financial risk. This needs to be defined in the shipman agreement. If you look at the ship owners, they would need to be prepared to compensate the manager of any additional related cost and provide financial guarantees. And in another way, if you imagine that the vessel is having a surplus compliance on excess, are performing better than the regulatory requirements, that has a value, and there's no owner who gives away that value for free to the technical managers for their financial benefit. So that also need to be regulated. If you remember back again to the different strategies for bunkering, there are different cost elements connected to the different compliance measures. This is something that we think will be the owner's responsibility to manage and select what should be the compliance measure. And of course, the owner need good data to manage both financial and commercial terms in the contract. I think BIMCO is coming with a shipman term these days, and put that high on the agenda to make an update sooner than later, is my advice. Another thing that is interesting to look at here and to be aware of is that the entity that is responsible here is the ISM company at the end of the year. So let's say you are changing ISM company mid-year. It will, from company A to company B, it will be company B who is responsible for the entire year. That has some implication on partial verification from company A to be submitted to B, etc. But also and ensuring that and company B ensures in the contract with the owner that they will be compensated if there are any follow-up implication from the first period of the year. Be also aware that if a vessel is sold during the year, it's still the company at the end of the year who will be responsible for the entire year. Therefore, this needs to be part of the financial settlement and the due diligence at the point of sales. If you look into the interfaces further down the value chain, we have different type of contracts. BIMCO came now with their TC terms, a good starting point for defining how to interact, where we see clauses expecting that we are meeting the intensity requirement and additional settlement logics between an owner and a charterer based on compliance balance. Compliance balance here is a key point of reference in these settlement logics. If you look at voyage charter, from what we see, this will predominantly be included in the charter rates. So not a separate clause, similar as we see on ETS, but there will be some cases where we have a need for separate settlement clauses similar to the TC terms, e.g. when a vessel is loading at one location and the delivery destination might be a little bit unsure. In those cases, I think we will see separate settlements. For a contract of affreightment, we expect to see this included in the freight rates. However, I've also seen some other logics here, but the predominant one is to include it in the freight rate. An interesting contract that I think is worthwhile thinking about is if you are involved in pools or if you are a pool, commercial pool, what is the role of the pool with respect to FuelEU? Because if you go back again to see the difference between being compliant and paying the penalty, it might be an advantage that the pool take the responsibility to make the vessel in the pool compliant as a compliance pool manager. Agreeing these roles is important, and it might be financially beneficial to do it, and it will also simplify the interface between the pool partner and the pool itself. Let's look a little bit into the terms. And here I've just as an illustration, let's say it's a 6 months TC performed within the year to make it a little bit simpler. There will be terms defining use of compliant fuel or making the vessel compliant, and the contract need to regulate how to compensate surplus and deficit on the compliance balance. If there is a deficit, if you look into the BIMCO terms, deficit is compensated based on expected penalty level from the charterer to the ship owner. That's what's it referred to in the BIMCO term. If there's a surplus, the surplus should be compensated based on the pre-agreed value of deficit from the owner to the charterer. In the terms, there is also provided a recommendation to establish a cap on that compensation. I think these two elements will be heavily debated going forward, and we will see a lot of different variances here. Another element which I think is very good in that contract is that pre-entering a charter, the owner should provide a year-to-date compliance balance so that we know the FuelEU Maritime status of the vessel at the point of entering a charter, and then thereafter a monthly reporting of the compliance balance for the charter period. We also have seen, and I've been called by many out there who have been faced that charterers are requiring the right to pooling. So they should have the property rights of the pooling of a vessel. And that can be agreed in the contract. If that is the case, I would highly advise that the charterer also is getting the pooling obligation to have it balanced. So if they have the rights to do pooling, they should also have the obligation. And if pooling fails, how do we actually compensate it? The BIMCO term also referred to the charterer have the rights to do to manage this, but here the charterer have the right to instruct owner of pooling, banking, borrowing, given a notice period of X days prior to 30th of April the following year. If I was an owner and I got this notification on the 23rd of April, that would potentially create a lot of noise in my compliance management of my fleet. So my high and clear recommendation here is to agree and clarify pooling roles pre-entry of a charter party. That gives that creates more predictability on actually both sides. And 7 days before 30th of April is way too late, according to my book. I just want to go into one very, very different that makes FuelEU more complex than the ETS, and that's the prioritized fuel allocation. And this is key in order to minimize the cost of compliance. Understanding this is important, and having the capability to do this fuel allocation properly is important. And while ETS is a historical number based on what went out the funnel, this is not necessarily historical because of this element. So let's look at how a voyage is performed in real life. So follow the upper line. We have a voyage sailing into EU using 100 gigajoule with low GHG and intensive fuel. Then we have a port stay in EU with 50 gigajoule. We have an intra-EU voyage with 75 gigajoule, and then 50 in the last port stay in EU before going out again. While in EU we are using the fossil fuel, but on the in and out legs, we are using the low GHG fuel. Then we need to calculate what is the energy in scope. And as we see, the energy in scope is 50% of the inbound, so 50 gigajoule of the 100. Then everything that is in within, and 50% of the out. Then we have the energy in scope. And here we can then reshuffle the energy for prioritized fuel allocation. So we move all the low greenhouse gas intensity fuel within the scope of within the scope, and then we are doing the calculation. And this is why FuelEU Maritime is not the historical number, it's quite dynamic. And this is something that we need to be able to manage on both a voyage level, a charter period level, and year to date. If we then look into how this is to be handled and why it's relevant, is that let's say we are going into this contract on a TC terms, following the basic principle in BIMCO. And let's say the vessel is entering into a contract March 1st next year. We should then pre-delivery prepare a compliance balance of the vessel up to date. So a compliance balance for January and February with an optimized fuel allocation. And when we are coming down the road, we also need to report the previous reporting period. But for the first year, that's not relevant. During a charter period, there is a guidance on within 15 days in the next month, we should notify an owner should notify to the charterer the aggregated compliance period for the charter period. That's not the year to date, but it is from enter to charter until the date of reporting. So you need the capabilities to do fuel allocation on different time periods: year to date, pre-contract, and charter period to date. And I would also then, as we see on the ETS side, how could we document this with verified data, the compliance balance, to support the potential settlement processes and collaboration processes between the parties? If we look at a little bit a generic framework for enabling control of FuelEU Maritime, and here I grouped all the different roles into one box of the ship owner. And towards the authority, there's an exercise once a year. It's an annual compliance balance per ship, and it's a compliance measure. What do we do in order to make the vessel compliant? Internally and towards the charterer, if you look at an individual vessel, you are doing pre-voyage calculation when you're agreeing charter rates. You're doing post-voyage calculation, and these two need to include the elements of FuelEU Maritime. I would also heavily recommend to follow up the individual vessel for accounting purposes on compliance balance on the voyage level, charter period, every charter period, year to date, and of course then at the end, the annual one. Towards the charter, you have the charter rates similar to what you have in the past, but then on the potential additional areas, will we have additional settlement, separate settlement logics for FuelEU? If yes, that's needed. Do you need to share data with your charterer? If you need to do that, that's additional one. And if you have given away their pooling rights to the charterer, also remember to give away the obligation. That's also relevant for how to handle this going forward. For a ship owner's total fleet, it's important to follow up the financial implication both on the fleet, and if you have a large fleet, you will probably divide this into separate sub-fleets, or call it a pool. And you would like to follow up the year-to-date performance of your fleet or your pool with respect to compliance balance. And it's important to have the capability to simulate the different compliance strategies in order to be able to select the cheapest, the lowest cost of compliance alternative. So this is a model, high level, but highly relevant to ensure that is in place. As I mentioned earlier, consistency in data is key. And we see now a lot of cases out there where they realize that the different players in this value chain have different data sets, and they're starting discussing who have the right data. We are advocating creating one universe of verified emission data. And we have now several cases out where this is actually happening, and it's not very difficult. We have cases where, I'd say, let's say illustrated with an owner. They have 3-4 different ISM companies. They're basing their management of MRV and their commercial contracts based on data from their manager that is shared to them, and they are sharing the data to the operator, ensuring that the vessel from A to B looks the same if you are the ISM company, the owner, or the commercial operator, and the charterer if relevant. We also see cases where commercial operators or pool companies have good data for their vessels and are sharing good data, verified data, back again to owners for MRV reporting and ETS, and to ISM companies for DCS and FuelEU Maritime reporting. This looks a little bit tricky, but it's really not that tricky if you are using the standardized Lego bricks that we are able to facilitate. And the essence is, of course, that you're using consistent data for commercial and business management as the data that you're using for the regulatory reporting. Key points to summarize. Data quality is key. I think I used that word many times already, but it's still important. Update commercial contracts and include terms for FuelEU Maritime. And pooling, who is responsible for pooling. I worked a lot with companies now simulating and estimating compliance balances for fleet and compliance pools, establishing strategies for how to minimize cost of compliance with other alternative fuels. How much do you need in order to nail this, and what is the business case? And be on the ball on evaluating the alternative compliance measures. And remember, it's only 19 days before the party starts. Over to you, Simon, for the poll.
Thanks, Helge. So we'd like to take a little break here now to get some of your thoughts around the FuelEU Maritime. And from what you know so far, from what is taking place with your businesses, we'd like to know what is the biggest challenge in terms of the FuelEU Maritime and its commercial impact. So we have some options there: the adjustment of charter contracts with stakeholders, organizing emissions data for effective management, compliance surpluses and poolings, what is the practical mechanism, your understanding of the regulation and its requirements, or if this doesn't apply to you yet. So we'll give you a minute or so to put your response in there. And here we got our responses. So a pretty even split, I would say. from the responses. Helge, what do you make of that? It looks like it's really across the board.
It seems like it's a little bit across the board. I think that also probably, but I'm not surprised in a way of the two on top, because adjusting these contracts is not necessarily easy, and you need actually to understand the regulation and the implication in order to do contract updates in the proper way. So I would say that those two are, that's probably where we spend the most time as well. But then also then be ready to support whatever is agreed in these contracts. And I think while we on ETS had a lot of focus on statements and pricing, I think this is more about also about how to manage internally properly. And the redistribution part is really making it a little bit more tricky than what ETS is. So this is, I think this is a good mirror of my numerous meetings over the last month on what is the key topics.
Yeah, I can think we can also see from our side that the continued interest in these regulations mean that people are really still grappling with understanding the requirements and needing still more information on them.
Yeah. Good. If you then look at support from DNV, we have our Emission Connect tool. That is a tool on our Veracity platform enabling continuous verification of data and sharing between all the stakeholders in the value chain, ensuring consistency. It enables you to have high quality emission data, verified voyage statements, time period statements. You can do simulations of FuelEU, for example, what is expected exposure going forward and how much biofuel is needed for nilling the penalty. It gives you control on data and how to share across the value chain. And we have an extensive partner network who enables you to digitalize this process and simplify the data handling, reducing the admin burden. We also have the FuelEU Maritime white paper that was published last week. I would say it's a good educational document with comprehensive details about the requirement, the different compliance options, cost elements to it, and it gives you a good understanding of roles, responsibility, and how to manage and navigate in the commercial implications and impacts of this. And then over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Helge. As you can see on the page here we've got up, we've got a huge amount of resources and things to check out on our DNV webpage. So we really encourage you to go through there if you're looking for more information, if you're seeing the other services and resources that we have online, to head over to the DNV Maritime websites. We have everything there from the AFI portal, which has up-to-date information on alternative fuel uptake and bunkering. We have our publications, which cover all of the various things. You can also sign up for our newsletters, to our service pages from Emissions Connect to the other advisory services. You can get all of our webinars. We have other ones on FuelEU Maritime and some of the other regulations, as well as more general topics on decarbonisation. We have our full decarbonisation hub, which covers many of the most important topics there. And of interest here, if you're looking for more information on current maritime regulations, the technical and regulatory news, which are sent out and have in-depth, detailed discussions of the latest regulations which are coming out sort of the day or the week that those are released. Everything from the IMO updates to IX regs to to anything that you might need as part of your business. So I really do encourage you to head over there, check those out, and make sure you're signed up for our publications and the TechReg news to get those for free. We've had a lot of questions, and as we do expect. So I think we are now moving on to our Q&A session, and we would like to encourage you to stay a little longer. I think since we have so many questions, we will try and keep going a bit longer and hope that that fits with your schedules. So we give ourselves maybe an extra 5 or 10 minutes to cover as many of these as we can, because we've got great questions from our audience. And let's kick it off straight away with the one of the basic ones. How are the calculations of greenhouse gas data different between the EU ETS and the FuelEU Maritime?
Yes, I can take that one quickly. So we've seen in one of the first slides that basically similar data is really used under EU ETS or MRV and FuelEU Maritime, with some differences, for instance, related to transport work, which is not that relevant in FuelEU Maritime. Actually, distance sailed is not as well. So the focus is on the energy consumption, including fuels, and other energy sources, so electricity, which is not considered under EU MRV. So the basic differences are with electricity, and that some of the metrics are simply not used across EU MRV and FuelEU Maritime, mostly related to cargo carried, but still cargo reporting is important for the determination of port of call, for example. And of course, the basic difference, FuelEU Maritime being on well-to-wake emissions, and EU MRV on tank-to wake emissions.
Thanks for that, Peter. Here we go. In FuelEU, do we take into account the transshipment ports the same as is done as we do for the EU ETS? So another one on the difference between the regulations.
Yes. So actually, the legislation relating to that will be available for public feedback shortly. And from what we've heard, we should expect the same ports to be recognized as neighboring transshipment ports under FuelEU Maritime, but the official information will come, and as I say, it will be available for public feedback as well. So, but we don't expect differences there.
Another one on the regulations here. Do we know the expected timeline for when the penalties for non-compliance for FuelEU will need to be paid or levied?
Yeah, I saw a couple of questions around it, and we need to remember that this is different than the deadline to submit EU allowances. That's purely ETS. On the FuelEU side, the deadline to settle the penalty with competent authority is end of June, and by this time, the document of compliance, FuelEU document of compliance, must be placed on board. So end of June is the deadline to settle the penalty, following a year where the penalty was where the deficit was generated.
Yeah, I think we had quite a lot of questions around change of ownership, I think, as well. And maybe if we had some time, we could run through quickly again the changes of ownership and how DOC holder switches a little bit around this, because this does seem to be a complicated topic that people are very interested in sort of hearing more about.
Yes, so from compliance point of view, the ultimate responsible company for the annual FuelEU report is the company responsible for that ship by end of year. And in case there was a change of company throughout the year, then there is an obligation to submit a partial FuelEU report. But then ultimately, the company responsible by year end is responsible for the average annual GHG intensity, meaning that there will need to be settlements happening between the two companies. And on that, I guess Helge could comment a bit.
Yes, and I think this is it's an important point because let's say the vessel is sold 1st of June. You actually need the compliance balance as of 1st of June in order to do a final settlement between the seller and the buyer, and that should be a part of the due diligence process and included in the agreement. So don't forget this topic. And I know that you would say that waiting a month in some cases is not necessarily good enough for this, but then there are other means to do a proper due deal and get the proper statement established.
Another question, I mean, there are many questions around the pooling, and especially in terms of the ISM management of vessels within a pool and how this is likely to function. Do they have to have the same ISM manager? How is that likely to function, Dan?
I think, are you answering, Piotr, or should I try?
Yeah, the regulatory part I can cover. So it may include ships across different companies, different ISM companies. So there is no limitation to this, at least. And there was also a question related to who should be the verifier, the pool verifier, and whether all ships must be verified by the same one. And this is not the case. So ships can be verified by different verifiers, and then there is this ultimate verifier of the pool, which can be a different one from the ones which from the verifiers which verify the individual ships. But on the contractual sides related to pooling, then I can only relate to you, Helge.
And this is I think it's in the forming, but the one that is entering the data of the individual ship and the pool is the different ISM companies. Let's say that a commercial pool is a compliance pool manager. They will need to structure it, inform the different owner, who inform the different ISM companies. So it will be a little bit complex. I think the final definition from EU on how this is to be done is still not 100% settled. So I'm not concerned about it. However, there are some issues to follow and see how could we, how is it practically done in real life. But it's the ISM company that updates, but it might be under instruction from someone else in the value chain.
Yeah, sticking to pooling, we also had a couple of quite sort of detailed questions that might speak to that. What happens, can you have a vessel in a pool for less than one verification year? And can you bank surpluses and then sell those on into a pooling arrangement in a future period? Or would the pooling be limited to the single compliance year?
I think we have to divide this into different dimension, because towards the authority, it's a vessel year that is the compliance period. However, we also see, and this is in the making as we speak, trading platforms who enables trading and managing shorter period than a year. We are in the early days, and there are some of these new trading platforms out there who really has cracked the code on a shorter period than a year and how to manage this. And I think it will be extremely interesting to see how that evolve in the beginning of next year, because that is when things really happens. It's tested, it's out there, but how to sell, let's say I am a charter who have used biofuel for 2 months and I'm struggling on getting the compensation and keeping the benefit of this one. With some of the new trading platforms, you are able to itemize this surplus and own a future in the future pooling of that vessel, for example, which would be a pretty smooth way of handling it. But we need to see it in real life, and real life is first after January 1st. So follow a good advice, Simon, to our audience is to follow what is happening in that market now on trading of surpluses or deficits.
Yeah, I guess it's with many markets, these things need to be established before people can really see what's happening with them. We got quite a few questions around, and this is quite relevant because it was a big part of our recent maritime forecast to 2050 around shore power and the calculation factors, how this would be reported to the EU, and how that is factoring in.
Yes, so indeed there have been some questions. So the simple answer is that any electricity received through onshore power supply is treated with a well-to-wake emission factor of 0, and there is no need to prove that it's green electricity, and this is to drive the uptake of the use of electricity in ports. So any electricity used throughout port stays in scope of FuelEU Maritime is treated as 0 GHG intensity source of energy.
Yeah, that's very good. I mean, I think we had some quite interesting calculations around shore power, which I definitely encourage people to check out the conclusions of that report there. Let's head back to our questions. Some probably around our own services from DNV on what's coming up. When will it be possible to submit our FuelEU MP in CETS?
Yeah, so the submission to TETIS is possible today, and the information which I confirmed in one of the slides is that DNV can assess officially the plan in TETIS, so the complete process can be carried out. But for those of you who have not yet submitted your plan to TETIS portal, we will follow with a clear instruction on how to do.
Yeah, another question that's just popped up recently, and maybe is a good one to talk about. It was asking if there are any calculators available. We've often had free tools from DNV to support our customers or even anybody to work out their compliance penalties or things like that under the regulations. Have we got any available now that people could check out, or have we got any planning in the works, sort of things that can help people easily work out some of their penalties or compliance things?
I think our existing clients for DCS and MRV have insight to historical data on the insight side, and in our emission connect tool we have also the simulators and statement generation, and if anyone who don't have it would like to test it out, there are in the slides we shown links for ordering free trials to test it out. And currently there is a lot of companies doing that in order to prepare for next year.
Yeah, a very good reminder that we have many, many resources available online. Many of them, as Helge said, then you can sign up for testing for free, or to get in contact with us if you do need advice or some support on these topics. I think we've headed over time. I think this is probably a good time to call the end of it. Thank you so much for taking part in the webinar. Thank you so much for sticking with us. To our presenters, a big thank you for your time and insights, which I'm sure our attendees have found very, very valuable. As we said at the start, we will have a full recording of the webinar available to you, along with all the slides. We have the resources online that you can check out. Please get in touch, of course, if you need any more support through our web portals and links. And if you're interested in more of the topics that we cover, head over to our DNV webinar pages, where they're all there available for download or for screening, and you can check those out. They're all free. Once again, thank you so much. We will look forward to seeing you in our next webinar next year. I think this is our last for 2024. It's been an absolute pleasure to have so many people attend and been able to share so many interesting topics. And take care. Thanks again to our presenters, and we hope you have a wonderful holiday break whenever you get there, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you so much, and goodbye.